guys, this is Mike, letusreason.com. Today we're going to discuss a common misunderstanding in the Bible prophecy world. Yeah, I'm sure none of you saw that coming. Just kidding, of course. Yeah, so it's unfortunate that there are so many things out there that need correction. And it's a sad thing when people just hear these kind of things from popular YouTubers and don't really spend as much time reading the actual Bible like a Berean, like they're supposed to see if those things are actually true. Well, some of the time, my job is pretty difficult in trying to address and hopefully correct these kind of misunderstandings, where I have to sometimes dig kind of deep and really go into the Greek and other things like that. But fortunately, a lot of the time, it's actually quite easy. And today's going to be one of those kind of days. This is not going to be a difficult thing, it's only going to require reading comprehension. We're going to discuss a common claim that's made by many. It's an understanding or a misunderstanding that's held by many people. But in this case, I'm mainly referring, I think, mostly to pre-trib teachers or pre-tribulationalists who, in terms of the teachers, they state that the Bible says believers will know the season of the rapture or know the general season of the return of Christ. So they often say that we don't or won't know the exact day or hour, referring to something that Jesus often said. But they say that we, in fact, will know the season. Now, I've gotten many comments like this on my videos, and people often point to Paul's teaching on the coming of Christ that we find in 1 Thessalonians Chapter 5, which they think backs up this claim. In addition to 1 Thessalonians 5, they also sometimes look to Jesus' statement to the Pharisees, where he criticized them for understanding the natural signs in the sky, the physical weather patterns, but they couldn't see the signs of his first messianic coming. Now, I'm going to handle that in a separate video, but today's video is specifically on this issue of knowing the season and that word season that we see used in 1 Thessalonians 5:1. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Is it saying what so many people seem convinced it's saying? Well, of course, let's look right into the passage and begin our discussion. So, 1 Thessalonians 5 begins with this statement of Paul. He says, "But of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you." All right, so if we stop right there, there's many different ways this could be understood. But the way that many people understand it is that Paul is basically saying that regarding the season of the Lord's coming, I don't even need to write to you about it because you already know it. And what do these people think the Thessalonians already know? They think it means that the Thessalonians already know about the so called signs that tell us when the season is. So they think Paul is basically saying that these things are already so well known that he doesn't even need to write about it, that there's going to be tons of these signs that everyone knows about that are going to tell you exactly when you're living in the general season of the return of Christ. Guys, have you heard people say this? I know I have, tons of times. I see it in my comments. I hear it on so-called Bible prophecy channels. I even hear very educated Bible teachers just kind of casually throw this out there and refer to this verse as a justification. But it always amazes me how people just see what they want to see in the Bible, despite that if you simply keep reading, you can see that it's blatantly obvious that it's actually saying the total opposite of this. It's not saying, I don't even need to write about the times and seasons because you already know the signs. It's saying, I don't even need to write about the times and seasons because you know it's going to come completely suddenly without signs. So it's the direct opposite. It's going to come without warning, imminently, which means there are no signs. It can simply just occur as we should expect at any moment, at any time. That's the teaching. So, in other words, what he's saying is that since you already know so clearly from the teachings of Jesus that the timing is completely unpredictable to everyone, including Paul himself, then you don't even need me to write about it. You already know full well because the original Parousia teachings of Jesus. Now, that's the Greek word that's often translated as coming in our English Bibles, talking about the coming of Christ. So let me just show you this, which is so obvious and it's explicit as you keep reading. There's no way that you guys can get this wrong. And we can see this, it's explicit, where verse 2 then begins by explaining exactly why they didn't need Paul to write about the timing aspect. It's not left up to our imaginations. He tells the audience exactly why he didn't need to write to them about it. So in 1 Thessalonians 5:2, the verse that follows, he says, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night." And so Paul is saying regarding the times and seasons, or in other words, the issue of the timing, that you don't even need me to write to you about it. Why? What he says here, for or because you yourselves already know that the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. Guys, does a thief give signs of his coming? No, that's the entire point. A thief comes without warning, totally without any signs, totally unpredictably. That's the point of the comparison. There are no signs that pertain to the coming of a thief. And to miss that is to miss the entire point of his usage of that analogy. Remember, an analogy is used because it's supposed to be simple. It's supposed to be something that everybody agrees on. It's common sense. It's everyone knows it full well. It's something obvious or basic that everyone anywhere can understand. That's why we use analogies to convey information or meaning by using a simple and basic concept that anyone can relate to. And what is that? That thieves, by very nature, come without warning, unpredictably. That's the basic function of how a thief plans to enter. So this was used to describe the manner in which the Lord's coming, or the parousia, will initiate. I'll say that again. It's used to describe the manner in which the Lord's coming is going to initiate or begin or occur. And the idea is that nobody can possibly ever confuse this, because everybody knows that thieves operate exactly the same in all cultures, in all time periods, throughout history. It doesn't matter when. It's a forever enduring principle that thieves come without warning and without signs. So that should be so simple. That should be so easy and obvious. But despite how incredibly over the top, simplistic, and obvious it is, somehow people still mess this up and think it's saying somehow the opposite. It's unbelievable, as if this verse isn't even here. Now, a quick point here is that the context, no matter what term we choose to use, and there's a handful that we could use, that all relate to the same moment in time. It's all relating to the beginning of the period that of what we consider eschatology, or what we think of as the end times. The beginning of the day of the Lord in its broad sense, not the narrow climactic sense, which is the end of the tribulation. It's speaking about the beginning of the broad day, the broad sense, the broad period of the day of the Lord, which begins with the rapture and ends with the ending of the millennium. That's what the broad period of the day of the Lord encompasses. So it's talking about the absolute beginning of that time period. So the rapture begins and it kicks off the broad day. It's the opening event of the broad day. And another term that we could use is the parousia, which again, like I said, is the Greek biblical term that's often used when we see it in English, the word coming, the coming of Christ, or the parousia of Christ. It begins with the rapture, where Christ comes for his church, and it ends with the ending of the tribulation, when Christ comes to earth to execute judgment. So again, I hope you just picked up on this, but the parousia doesn't have the same time period coverage as the broad day of the Lord. They begin at the same time. They don't end at the same time. The parousia ends with the coming of Christ at the end of the tribulation, where he physically comes back to the earth. But the day of the Lord continues to the end of the millennium, which follows. So you could say that the parousia begins at the same time as the broad period of the day of the Lord, but it's a subset within the larger or broader period, the broad day of the Lord. Hope everyone gets that. So the parousia is a period of time. It's not an instantaneous, momentary event. So everyone got that? It's from the rapture to the end of the tribulation, because the Bible uses this term parousia explicitly in reference to both. So it refers to this entire period. You can refer to this chart that I have up for more of a visual of what I'm saying here. Okay, so let's go back to the passage. So Paul begins by saying regarding the timing of the Lord's parousia, or the beginning of the broad day, I don't even need to waste time telling you what you already know. The timing is unpredictable, so let's just move on. That's basically what he's saying. That's what it means. Now, there's so much more to talk about here. So let's start with this. Does anyone find it strange that Paul begins a chapter by saying, but of the timing issue? I'm paraphrasing. You find that to be a strange way to begin a thought? Yes, of course. But it means that it wasn't the beginning of his thought. He's simply continuing an already ongoing context or discussion. See, you got to understand that we're often the victims of the really unfortunate decision sometimes to break up the chapters in the way that they were. This was done by man. This wasn't part of the inspired text. Man decided this, and a lot of times they, I think, did a good job. But there's sometimes where like this time, it actually obscures the flow of the narrative because Paul wasn't beginning a totally new thought as he begins in chapter 5. And that's obvious from the wording. Like we said, even if you never read the end of chapter 4, you can tell that he's continuing an already ongoing context. He's not starting something new. But if we go back to the end of chapter 4, we can see what that topic was that Paul was then continuing as he began what we now call chapter 5. But when he wrote it, again, it was all just one continuous thought without any chapter breaks. So, what was he talking about? What timing or what season is he referring to in verse 1? Well, obviously, the foregoing topic. And what was that? It was the rapture of the church. At the end of chapter 4, Paul gives us, of course, the most well known rapture passage in the entire New Testament, where he uses that famous Greek word harpazo that we all know, from which we get the English word rapture through the Latin translation of harpazo. So let's read and see this. In verse 13, he starts by saying, But I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. For this say we unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up, that Greek word harpazo or rapture, together with them in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore, comfort one another with these words. 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18. And so Paul's original context here in chapter 5 is the rapture of the church, which takes place at the beginning of his parousia. But then notice how Paul seamlessly transitions into chapter 5. We're going to read verse 1 again. I'm going to read verse 1 and 2. So he goes right from reading from writing what I just read to you now into just seamlessly saying, But of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. And so at the end of chapter 4, he's talking about the what of the rapture. He's explaining what the rapture is. He's explaining what takes place at the rapture. But then he moves from the what, now as chapter 5 begins, to the when. But the subject is the same, the rapture, which takes place at the beginning of the broad day, which is why he can seamlessly use that term broad day when his context was the rapture, because he's talking about the same moment in time. Guys, please get this. Again, that's why he's able to transition from talking about the rapture, what it is, to now the timing. But he then mentions the day of the Lord. So there's obviously a temporal connection between the rapture and the day of the Lord. Temporal, which means related to timing or sequence. So, in other words, it happens at the same time. He's saying, here's what happens at the rapture. Here's what the rapture is or involves. But concerning the when it's going to take place, well, you already know that the broad day of the Lord, when the rapture happens, begins suddenly, unpredictably, without warning, just like Jesus repeatedly told you in places like the Olivet Discourse, which they were all very familiar with. Remember, this would have been one of the most important teachings to them. When Jesus left, it's all about when he's coming back. See, we're not used to that because we live 2,000 years from that time period. We never saw Jesus in person. We never saw people who saw Jesus in person. We never saw the apostles and the eyewitnesses to Jesus. It's not that Jesus, like he was just here, like our grandparents were just here or something. But that's what these people, that's the context, the setting that they lived in, where Jesus was just here. And we're supposed to expect him to come back at any time. It was all about when he's coming back. That was the number one thing that they were thinking about, is that he's coming back and it could happen at any time. So you got to put yourself in their position. They're living in the first century, just a couple decades after when Jesus was physically there. And so his return and the timing of it would have been so incredibly important to them. And so Jesus's Perusia teachings in the Gospels about the timing of his coming, about when he's going to return, would have been such an just critical, important topic that they all would have prioritized and known about. And that's why Paul then repeats the analogy of the thief in the night, again, because they're familiar with this stuff, because that's what Jesus said in Matthew 24, in the Olivet Discourse and other places where he uses the unpredictable sudden coming of a thief to describe his Perusia. Guys, you got to see these connections. It's all talking about the same thing. You don't think Paul just made up this whole mention of the thief here in 1 Thessalonians 5, do you? No, of course not. He himself got that from Jesus's teachings, and he assumed that his readers were already very well aware of it, and they were. And so notice that this means then that we can go back to the Olivet Discourse and anywhere else where we see the thief mentioned in connection with the Lord's coming and other language like this, and immediately know the context, the absolute beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord, when the rapture happens as its opening event, the beginning of the Perusia of Christ. So you see how just simple the Bible is? You can just connect these dots. Paul uses the same key words, key language, key terms, key references, key examples, key analogies as Jesus did. Well, he isn't changing anything. He's not using it differently than Jesus did. So if Paul is very clearly talking about the rapture here, which he obviously is, then we need to understand Jesus's teachings the same way that Paul did. So don't tell me that the rapture isn't in the Olivet Discourse. When Jesus begins to discuss the unpredictability of the beginning of his Perusia in Matthew 24:36, this is the context. If you disagree, then you disagree with Paul also, because clearly that's what he's basing his teaching on here in 1 Thessalonians 5. Otherwise, he wouldn't be using the exact same language in the exact same context that he originally heard from Jesus. And so again, we have to understand Jesus the same way that Paul did. Paul tells us exactly how we have to understand it. There should be zero confusion or ambiguity about this. It's completely straightforward, guys. Paul interprets it for us. And as usual, I never want you to think that I just dreamed all of this up. So I'm actually going to give you the words of some of the finest New Testament Greek scholars in the past century. One of them, Dr. Robert L. Thomas, actually wrote the best, I think, hands down, the best Revelation commentary in the history of the church age. And Dr. Robert L. Thomas, he says exactly what I just told you. I'm going to share that with you. And as a further confirmation of what I just told you, he also mentions the Greek phrase peride, which is translated as but of or now concerning, which begins, we see that in chapter 5, verse 1. That marks this transition between the end of chapter 4, the what of the rapture, now to the timing. Peri but of the times and seasons, or now concerning the times and seasons, which is this Greek phrase that typically marks a transition from a related or to a related, yet a different context. So, in other words, it's continuing the same subject, but it's now going to just address it from a different angle. So it's another piece of evidence that in the Greek, Paul was just continuing his discourse, still talking about what he had just spoken of at the end of chapter 4, the rapture. And he's now transitioning into discussing another aspect of that same subject. It's an ongoing subject, but he's transitioning from discussing the what to now the when aspect. So it's another proof that the subject is continuing. So let's see what he says. Dr. Robert L. Thomas, that is. He says the peri or now concerning, that begins chapter 5, turns to a new aspect of the same subject discussed at the end of chapter 4. The connective phrase marks a shift in thought, but a shift that is not without connection to the foregoing. 1 Thessalonians 5:1 speaks of the times and seasons. What other times and seasons could these be but the ones pertaining to the catching away of those in Christ, about which Paul had just written? Obviously, both the previous and the following contexts relate to the parousia, or the coming of Christ. So he says exactly as I just told you guys. Now, watch what he says as he continues, because it's also exactly what I just told you earlier. He says the Thessalonian readers had an accurate awareness of the unexpectedness of the arrival of the day of the Lord, having received prior instruction from the apostle based on the teachings of Jesus. But they were ignorant of and therefore perplexed about what would happen to the dead in Christ at the time of Christ's return. Before beginning his review of the imminence of the day of the Lord in 5:1-11, Paul has already in 4:13-18 clarified for them that the dead in Christ will have an equal and even a prior part in the events surrounding Christ's return, that the catching away of those in Christ is temporally connected with the day of the Lord is the natural understanding of the sequence from 1 Thessalonians 4 to 1 Thessalonians 5. Okay, so guys, it's exactly what I just told you. So he's clear that the Thessalonians already understood that the parousia, or beginning of the broad day of the Lord, the rapture, occurs imminently or suddenly, signlessly, without warning. And he says that they knew this because of what they had been taught from the teachings of Jesus, like the Olivet Discourse. And that he speaks of the what of the rapture because they lacked some understanding of what happens at that time. But Paul then transitions to the when, and he says, well, we don't even need to discuss that. You already know that. Because Jesus didn't fully discuss what happens at the rapture. It was Paul now who was watering those seeds that Jesus planted. Jesus talked about what we today call the rapture, but he didn't talk about it in detail. That was Paul's job. Paul was revealing in its fullness church age truth. He revealed what the church was. Jesus talked about the church, but he didn't explain it in the fullness of the doctrine of what it is. That was Paul's job. Same with the rapture. Jesus planted those seeds, those doctrinal seeds, but he didn't bring them to fruition. Paul did. That was what Paul was doing here. But when it comes to the timing, Jesus did fully explain that aspect. And that's why Paul says, when it comes to the timing, the times and the seasons, we don't even need to discuss that. You already know that because Jesus spent so much time driving that home. It should be one of the most plainest, most well understood things ever. Something that nobody at that time would have ever been confused about. People are confused today because of YouTube and by so-called Bible prophecy entertainers, so-called Bible prophecy teachers, I should say, who are really just entertainers. But there was none of that back then at this time. They had in mind so clearly what Jesus said about, I'm coming back soon. Watch for me. I could come at any moment. And just like I also said earlier, he mentions that the way that these passages are constructed, Dr. Thomas mentions this, that the way the passages are constructed, how the end of chapter 4 flows right into chapter 5 seamlessly. Even Dr. Thomas in this quote, he acknowledged that the way it just flows from one to the next reveals the temporal connection or the timing connection between the rapture and the beginning of the broad day. Guys, he even said it himself. That's the simple, natural reading. I don't know why people don't understand this. It's so simple. It's why Paul was able to speak the way that he did and make that smooth transition where he's talking about the rapture. And then he just moves right into the timing aspect of it and just assumes everyone already knows that the catching away is the opening event of the broad day of the Lord, the parousia, which is why he doesn't stop to explain the chronology. He just assumes you already know that the rapture begins the broad day, and it's all simultaneous and sudden. Remember, Dr. Thomas says this is the natural understanding. And this whole thing of the dual imminence of the rapture and the beginning of the broad day, along with the fact that they occur simultaneously, is essentially the entire point of my book, The Missing Key, that you see over my shoulder there. So if you've read it already, or you've heard me talk about this, then you already know this. This is all review to you, because all of this information and much more is all in there. All these quotes that I'm sharing with you come from the book. Now, you guys who are familiar with my work, you also already know that what Paul does here with the peri-day that I mentioned in 5:1, where he transitions from the what to the when, is almost exactly what Jesus does in the Olivet Discourse, where in the first half of the discourse, he answers the disciples' what questions about the signs of his parousia. What are the signs? Meaning the signs that occur during the broad day, or during the judgment phase of the broad day, during this extended period between the rapture and the end of the tribulation that we call the parousia. And then in, for instance, Matthew 24:36, he then transitions from the what, where he had just discussed the sequence of signs in that day, to now move to answer their when questions, where they ask, when will these things be? And he shifts there in verse 36 to begin to teach them of the imminence, the suddenness, the unpredictability of the beginning of his parousia, or the beginning of the broad day. And he uses a peri-day to mark that shift. So let me show you this in Matthew 24:36. So remember, Jesus just finished answering the question about the what, where he says all the signs that take place all throughout the day of the Lord. And now he transitions here in verse 36, but of, or peri-day, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. So in other words, but of the timing, just like Paul did, he talked about the what of the rapture and then moves to but of the timing, the times and the seasons, peri-day, now concerning, it's unpredictable. This is what Jesus is saying here. But of that day and hour knoweth no man. No, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So the whole point is he's transitioning now to answer the timing question. And what he says is so clear because his context continues from this verse all the way to the next chapter, 25, verse 13. Everything that follows is all about imminence, unpredictability, suddenness. It's coming without warning. Nobody can know it. Whereas the first section was all about predictability, signs, the sequence of signs that take place. So if you miss this contrast, guys, you're going to miss the entire discourse. You can't understand it without recognizing this context, this shift where he goes from signs to signlessness. He goes from answering the disciples' second question about the what of the day of the Lord to now answering their first question about the when of the day of the Lord. So he answers it backwards. First, he answers the second question, and then the first question. It's called a chiasm. It's a structure that you often see in Matthew. And just like Paul does in 1 Thessalonians 5, Jesus shortly after this verse also uses the example of the thief, which is exactly where Paul got this in the first place. So you know they're both talking about the exact same thing, the exact same context, using all the exact same language. They both talk about the unpredictability, the suddenness, the imminence of the beginning of the Parousia or the broad day. They both connect it with the thief analogy. And beyond that, they both describe a simultaneous rescue of the righteous and immediate beginning of judgment on the wicked who are left behind. So they both teach very clearly that the rapture and the beginning of the day of the Lord occur simultaneously. Remember, that's the whole point of Jesus then using the Noah analogy, where his whole point there, I talked about in the last video, is that the righteous, Noah and his family, were removed on the same day and relocated to a place of safety on the same day that the flood then came suddenly on those who were left behind, the wicked. The same day, they were immediately removed, and then immediately the judgment came unexpectedly on a world that was completely occupied with routineness, life as usual. That's why Jesus then also expands that analogy, please get this, to the two people in the field and the two grinding at the mill, where the one is taken and the other is left. Guys, they directly follow one another. Those things directly follow the Noah example. Well, if the Noah example is the baseline context, then, which obviously it is, and those examples are being used as a further expansion or a further explanation of the Noah example, then the same idea has to continue, where it's the righteous one who is the one being removed to safety, and then the one left behind must be the wicked one left to enter into the immediate judgment. You can't have it be the opposite of the Noah example because they go together. One comes right after the next. Jesus was saying the same thing. So again, Jesus is teaching the sudden rescue of the righteous, which is an early reference to the rapture, the rescue of the righteous. That's all they understood at that time, which is why then when Paul comes around, they didn't fully understand what happens at that time because these were just seeds that Jesus was beginning to plant. But Paul watered it, brought it to fruition so that they could fully understand. He brought this the seed doctrine that Jesus planted to germination, using the analogy of a plant. He brought it to fullness, bloom, blossom, so that they could understand it fully. Back then in the Olivet Discourse, they just understood it as the righteous who are there at that time are going to be rescued. They didn't understand it as the rapture, what we think of. Okay? That word harpazo wasn't used yet, but Paul used it to refer to the rapture, what we think of today, and he fully expanded upon it. So now those people and we today can look back, the people of Paul's generation and the people of our generation can all look back very easily on Jesus' Parousia teachings in the Olivet Discourse and understand exactly the context. So again, Jesus is teaching there about the sudden rescue of the righteous. Remember, it's imminent, it's sudden, it's signless, nobody's going to know. Takes place right at the beginning of the Parousia. That refers to the rapture. But he says that there's a simultaneous and immediate beginning of judgment, the judgment of the broad day, of course, that starts suddenly on the wicked who get left behind. That's why he used the Noah example. And we don't have to wonder about why he used the Noah example. He explains it to us. He explained exactly why he used the Noah example. I talked about it in the last video. So guys, Paul got this teaching, his teaching in 1 Thessalonians 5. He got this from this teaching of Jesus right here, the Olivet Discourse. That's why they're saying the exact same thing. Paul first describes the rapture. We see that at the end of chapter 4. He's giving further revelation about what the rescue of the righteous is that Jesus first introduced. And then he essentially says, but concerning its timing, you already know that it's unpredictable since it's the opening event of the broad day of the Lord, which you already know is unpredictable. Jesus was crystal clear about that part. And you know the rescue and judgment are simultaneous because that's what Jesus said. That's the whole point. So now let's look at another level of understanding here. There's so much. This is just line upon line. It's incredible. So, what did Paul then say after verse 2? Let's continue. He says that the day of the Lord begins suddenly as the first birth pang of a pregnant woman begins suddenly at a certain point in time during her labor. This should remind you also of what Jesus said. He said the same thing earlier in the Olivet Discourse when he referred to the opening signs of the broad day as the beginning of birth pang signs. So both Paul and Jesus use this same exact term and concept. It's this Greek word odin, which means birth pangs or travail, labor pains. So just to reorient ourselves with what we already read, let's start again from verse 1 and then see this as he starts to talk about it in verses 3 and 4. So Paul again says, but of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as travail upon a woman with child. That's the Greek word odin there, travail. And they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief. So, guys, what Paul is saying here is identical with what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse. They're both talking about the sudden, signless onset of the Parousia, or the broad day of the Lord. That's number one. It's the same context. They're talking about the day of the Lord. The Parousia is coming. Number two is they both use the thief analogy to express its unpredictability. Number three, they both say this period begins with a simultaneous rescue of the righteous and a beginning of judgment against the wicked who are left behind. Number four, they both use the same peri-day construction to go from a what to a when. Number five, they both compare the sudden arrival of this day to the sudden arrival of birth pangs that come on a woman in labor. So that's five connections. It's identical, but there's even more connections. We can keep going. Check this one out. Both of them take for granted that the sudden beginning of this period takes place out of a setting of life as usual. That's what Paul says here when he describes the sudden destruction coming during a time when people are expecting peace and safety. It's a time of normalcy, a time of relative mundaneness, calm. Now remember what Jesus said. He used the same context in the Noah analogy, where he says people are eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, and then suddenly the flood came on the unsuspecting wicked without warning. He's also there conveying a context of business as usual. People are just going about their life. They're not even thinking about a coming judgment. Now, let's think about that for a minute. That context is limiting. So it tells you exactly what the context is. It's completely incompatible with any time during the day of the Lord. Anytime the day of the Lord or Parousia starts, that context cannot apply because it's a sequence of judgments, which the Bible tells us is the worst that the world has ever seen. So this business as usual, peace and safety context is not applicable after that period begins. It can only speak about the time period immediately prior to its absolute beginning. The beginning of the Parousia, the beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord, because nothing during the day of the Lord, again, can be described as business as usual, where life is just calm and mundane and people are just going about their business as carefree as ever, not thinking about coming judgment or anything like that. You can't be not thinking about coming judgment when you're in judgment. Remember, the Bible describes this time period as the absolute worst period of time in distress and wrath and destruction, judgment that humanity has ever experienced. Let that sink in. And not only that, but the context of imminence, suddenness, can only refer to the absolute beginning of this period. That too. Nothing can be sudden after this period starts. Only the absolute beginning of this broad day can take the world off guard, like Jesus constantly says it will. And like Paul constantly says it will, like right here at the beginning of travail pains, birth pangs. Nothing after it begins can be sudden. Remember, he said sudden destruction, like the beginning of birth pangs. There were no birth pangs. There were no destruction, no judgment yet. And then suddenly it starts. Think about it, guys. I can't jump out and scare you after I've already jumped out and scared you. After I scare you, I lost the element of surprise. That should be obvious. And after the sequence of judgments in the broad day begin, the world can no longer be taken off guard by the sudden beginning of judgment. It's already started. So this should be incredibly obvious, but somehow people like to confuse this context in the Olivet Discourse and other places with the end of the tribulation somehow. No, it just doesn't work on numerous levels. I'm just giving you a taste of why it doesn't work. And remember, because Paul and Jesus are using the same language, the same examples, the same idioms, the same imminence expressions, then whatever one is talking about, we have to understand the other to also be speaking about that same time and context. And it's easy to understand what Paul's talking about because he uses the most well-known rapture passage that we all agree refers to the rapture and then seamlessly transitions into talking about the beginning of the broad day of the Lord and uses all the same language that Jesus used right there in the Olivet Discourse. They have to be understood and interpreted consistently. And this is the case for any time you see New Testament imminence language being used, anytime you see the thief being mentioned, anytime you see exhortations toward eschatological watchfulness for the coming of the Lord, that he's coming soon, quickly, that you have to watch. He's at hand, he's at the door. It's all what I like to call New Testament imminence language. So anytime you see that, you know that it all refers to the absolute beginning of this period of time called the day of the Lord in its broad sense. When the parousia begins, when the rapture happens, and then judgment immediately starts on those who are left behind. Guys, I'm purposely trying to be a little bit redundant here because with all due respect, I know a lot of you guys that listen to me on every video, I talk about pieces of this, but I know a lot of you are not actually processing what I'm saying. I can tell by the comments. And I know some of you have read my book even, which is all about this stuff. And I know you're still not processing it. I see it in the comments. So that's why I'm purposely being a bit repetitive. I want to drive this home that there's a deep level of evidence here. It's a paradigm, not just picking out a verse here and there and giving it my own meaning. Everything connects with everything, which is how you know something is correct. Because it lines up on every level. It's line upon line, word upon word, precept upon precept. If everything connects and supports everything else, then you can't refute it without throwing out everything. So let me now show you the words of some scholars who are going to just verify everything that I taught you in this video. Just show you that I'm not making this stuff up. Remember, I'm not a YouTube rapture entertainer. I'm not a Bible prophecy entertainer. I'm never going to teach you sensationalism and nonsense. So I validate things with actual scholarship, just so that you know it's not some wild stuff that I'm just making up. You're not going to just hear this from me. Now, obviously, I've shown you level after level of this evidence from the actual Bible itself, which really is all that matters, not what scholars say ultimately. But just to differentiate myself from all this nonsense that you guys hear and see on the internet, I want you to see that this is true and valid. This is sound. So, first, let me show you what Dr. Wayne Brindle, one scholar, says about the day of the Lord, the destruction that we just read about, how it begins like birth pangs suddenly, like Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5:3. I want you to notice what he says about the mention of peace and safety, because that mention limits the context to prior to the beginning of the broad day. So that's talking about the church age. It's the context, it's the setting of the end of the church age when this suddenly then happens. So it transitions suddenly from the end of the church age, and then the destruction suddenly happens. And obviously, immediately prior to that, the righteous are rescued or raptured. That's how the church age ends. It's sudden and it's unpredictable. So it's the end of the church age, the absolute beginning of the broad day, and not the end of the tribulation. The end of the tribulation cannot be the context. So he says this, that the destruction described in verse 3 is that of the judgment phase of the broad day as a whole, and not the day of vengeance accompanying Christ's second coming, he means at the end of the tribulation, or God's later judgment of the lost, is indicated by the fact that those who suffer this destruction are quoted as saying, peace and safety, just before the calamity suddenly and violently comes upon them. It is unthinkable that people could be saying near the end of the tribulation, or during the outpouring of heavenly signs, or at the time of Christ's final judgment, anything resembling peace and safety. All right, so let me now show you another great quote, and this one is from the late Dr. John Walvoord, and he also says the same as Brindle, and he echoes everything that I've said to you in this video, and he specifically calls attention to the overall point of this video, which again is that Paul here is not saying that we will know the season, but rather it's the opposite, that the discussion of the timing is unnecessary because they already knew it's unpredictable. He says this, the judgment will come when the world is expecting peace and safety, just the opposite of the time of trouble which is predicted. In that very time, sudden destruction comes. In the Greek New Testament, the word sudden is emphasized. That event will not be preceded by signs. That is, there will be no warning. There will be no possibility of escape. The illustration given is that of travail coming suddenly upon a woman with child. It will be God's divine, unescapable judgment upon those who are in darkness. The beginning of the day of the Lord is clearly not the second coming, meaning the second coming proper of Christ at the end of the tribulation. It is rather begun much before this, talking about the day of the Lord, and may begin at once when the day of grace, or the church age, closes with the translation or the rapture of the church. So he's proposing the same thing that I am. The church age ends and the broad day immediately begins with the rapture of the church. This is exactly the whole point of my book, The Missing Key, that the rapture and the beginning of the broad day begin simultaneously, both imminently. Now, let me show you another quote, and this is from Dr. John Hart, who's quoting another scholar, Dr. Renald Showers. And he says this, concerning the thief analogy in 1 Thessalonians 5, Showers notes, a thief depends upon the element of surprise for success. He does not give his intended victims a forewarning of his coming. Paul's point, the world will be given no warning of the coming broad day of the Lord, rules out any of the seals of Revelation as being forewarnings of the beginning of the broad day. So this is confirming the logic that I gave you about the context in these passages. They're not talking about the end of the tribulation or any time during it. They're talking about the absolute beginning of this entire broader period as a whole. The beginning of what we think of as the end times, when the parousia happens and the broad day starts. And again, Hart reminds us that the passage is crystal clear in 1 Thessalonians 5, that it begins imminently, without signs, which again defeats the idea that Christians know the season of approximately when the parousia occurs. No, guys, It's the opposite. Simple reading comprehension. This isn't difficult. So let me show you now one of my absolute favorite quotes ever. And this is again by Dr. John Walvoord. And he's basically saying more clearly what I read to you previously, where in this single quote, he essentially backs up my entire premise, my entire paradigm that I present in The Missing Key with this idea of a simultaneous rapture and beginning of the broad day, and that they're both imminent, or what I refer to as dual imminence. And he says this: when the rapture occurs, this work of God, referring to the church age, will be brought to its close, and the day of the Lord will begin. The period in general, the broad day of the Lord, would extend from the rapture until the end of the millennium, just like I told you guys. And he says this: the coming of the day of the Lord, therefore, is coincident or simultaneous with the rapture itself. And for this reason, the apostle, referring to Paul here in Thessalonians, discusses its arrival as if it were one and the same as the rapture of the church itself. Just as the day of the Lord would come as a thief, so also the rapture. All right, so guys, here's another thing that we need to talk about, because some people have also misunderstood this aspect as well. Let's go back to our passage in question, which is 1 Thessalonians 5, 1-4. Let's now focus on verse 4, which we really haven't looked at too much yet. So I'll keep the whole passage on the screen, but I'm just going to reread verse 4 specifically. It says, "But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief." Now, for some reason, I hear people saying that Paul's mention of Christians not being in darkness actually means that we're going to have some ability to predict the timing, despite that the entire point here has been the opposite all throughout. Now, further, they also look at how he says the day of the Lord won't overtake Christians. And they take that to mean, again, that we're going to have some ability to at least somewhat predict it, and that that's why it's not going to overtake us somehow. Now, I don't know how they come up with either of these interpretations, since all you have to do is read the passage to understand it's saying the direct opposite. It says we aren't in darkness, meaning spiritual darkness, of course, meaning that we're not saved. So it's saying that we aren't in darkness, that that day should overtake us, because we are saved. And as believers, part of our salvation includes the exemption from the judgment phase of the broad day. We're not going to experience any of it. Why? Because of what Paul began this whole topic with at the end of chapter 4, the rapture of the church. That's the mechanism for why the day won't overtake us, because we get rescued and raptured, removed immediately prior to the beginning of the judgment. That's the whole point. As the day of the Lord in its broad sense starts, the righteous people are taken out, just like Noah and the one that was in the field and grinding at the mill. And the judgment immediately starts on the wicked who are left behind. So in other words, the day of the Lord overtakes them, the wicked, because they didn't get raptured and taken out. So guys, to not be overtaken by that day doesn't mean that you were able to predict the season or the timing. It just means you were raptured so that you don't enter into that day. If you didn't enter into that day, then you were spared from being overtaken by it and its judgments. It couldn't overtake you since God pulled you off the planet immediately prior to its beginning. That's what it means to not be overtaken. The wicked left behind were overtaken by it, which means that they were left to enter into it and be subject to those judgments. The day began while they were still there. It overtook them, but we're going to be raptured out. So how anyone cannot understand this or get something else from this passage, I don't understand. It's completely simple and straightforward. So let me show you just one more quote that again confirms everything I'm telling you. Also from Dr. Walvoord. And he says, the statement, "But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief," contrasts the position of a Christian to that of one who's an unbeliever in that day. In other words, they're not saved. The world at the present time is in spiritual darkness, which will be followed by the day of the Lord, when the rapture occurs. So again, the rapture occurs as the day of the Lord begins. By contrast, the Christian is living today in the knowledge of divine revelation. In other words, we've been told about this. Though the church also does not know the precise date of the rapture, it's not unexpected, as in the case of the unbeliever, because of the peculiar fact that the church is going to be caught up to be with the Lord at the time the day of the Lord begins. So he's admitting that it's simultaneous. The day of the Lord will not overtake the church as a thief at all, and the church will lose nothing when the day of the Lord comes. So I also hear people saying, well, that shows you that he's not coming as a thief for the church. No, he's coming as a thief for everyone. The difference is the church is ready and we're not going to be overtaken by it. So nothing bad happens to us when the Lord comes as a thief. Guys, it's so simple. Otherwise, you're making the text deny itself. In every instance, the whole point is unpredictability for everyone, which again, going back to the Olivet Discourse, is why the Lord says, even to his righteous followers, you need to watch because you don't know the timing because I'm coming like a thief. It's not just the unbelievers. The church doesn't know. The believers don't know. Remember, the angels themselves don't know. Even the Son in his humanity doesn't know. Just the Father knows. So clearly that's the point. And so we're expecting the rapture at any moment, though we have no clue when it's going to happen. And we're going to be removed so as to completely avoid entering the broad day. So that's how the day doesn't overtake us. We're gone before it can touch us. And praise God for that. So let's start to wrap up this teaching, but I want to continue until the end of the segment that we were reading in chapter 5. We need to finish this out where Paul continues. And after this, he says, ye are all the children of light and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. For they that sleep, sleep in the night, and they that be drunken are drunken in the night. But let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for an helmet, the hope of salvation. For God hath not appointed us to wrath, meaning eschatological wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, meaning whether we're alive or dead, we should live together with him. Wherefore comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as ye also do. So Paul continues to discuss the position of a believer as being of the day and not the darkness. Now, obviously, this refers to the spiritual position of a Christian who's going to be raptured at that time. And we're encouraged to continue to watch for the Lord because he's coming as a thief with no signs. Remember, this too, Paul got from Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, as well as also Luke 12 and Luke 17. And as I've spoken about ad nauseum in my videos, the instruction is never to watch for signs, but instead to watch for the Lord himself, because there are no signs, since he's coming suddenly as a thief. Like I always say, watching for him doesn't mean you go out and pick a spot in your backyard or sit up on your roof and stare up at the sky until you see him. No, guys, it means spiritual preparation, obviously. It means being saved, staying in a spiritual condition of faithfulness so that when he comes, he's going to find you actually doing his will. And that his promise is that we're going to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ, by being raptured prior to the judgment, since we were not appointed to this eschatological wrath, as he said in that chapter. And the judgment phase of the broad day, of course, is the time of that wrath. It's the time of his judgments. And this promise of imminent rescue from imminent wrath is, again, supposed to be a comfort to us, something that we can edify one another with. We can build each other up in that, encourage one another. So, my friends, you cannot be a post-tribulationalist and obey this command by Paul in this passage. You can't. He says explicitly to comfort yourselves together based on this promise of the rapture, the pre-tribulational rapture that allows you to not be overtaken by the day of the Lord, because we're not appointed to wrath. And we're supposed to edify one another with Just the mention of this and the remembrance of this fact, a post-trib person can never fulfill this command because they're going to endure all this time. The day is going to overtake them. They just miss the final destruction at the end. But everything they're subject to before that. Let me remind you, this statement by Paul is a command. It's not a suggestion. It's an imperative statement. But a post-trib person cannot obey this command. They have nothing to be comforted by because by definition, they expect to be overtaken by that day. They're going to be there for the entire thing, just taken out after it ends. So they expect to be overtaken by it, and it's sudden beginning of sequence of judgments that we talked about. So they have nothing to comfort one another with and no promise to edify one another with. Why would they need to be rescued at the end of the tribulation? It's already happened already. Rescued to where? The next thing to take place is the millennial kingdom, which they're going to be there for. At that point, you don't need to leave. It doesn't make any sense to me. But I hope this teaching has really helped you guys to understand these, I think, critically important teachings on eschatology by Jesus himself, and then by Paul, who, like we examined, very clearly got this teaching in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 from the very words of Jesus. Yes, he was given additional understandings to convey to us, but the scaffolding, the foundation for it, the basic, meat and potatoes of it, the bones of it, go right back to what Jesus was teaching in the Olivet Discourse. That's why he said, you guys already know that we don't even have to talk about the timing, because that's the one thing they would have been familiar with. If nothing else, they would have been familiar with that one thing, because Jesus had just left a couple decades ago. So their entire mindset was, this is what he left us with. This is the mindset that he left us with, to look for him to possibly come back at any moment. So the anticipation would have been just off the charts in those first couple of decades. They expected it during their lifetimes at any moment. So they knew full well that the timing was unpredictable, and that's why Paul said this. He wasn't saying you will know the season. He was saying you won't. Regarding the timing, you won't know it. It's completely sudden, signless, and unpredictable. So I hope all the cross-referencing that we did today made sense to you guys and really helped to click for you as far as understanding all the evidences and these multiple levels of clues within these discourses that allow you to be absolutely sure, absolutely certain about the context. We know the Bible has some complexities to it, but it's magnified. These complexities, the confusion is magnified by being exposed to bad teaching that further confuses you and just muddles the water. And we know that the internet is full of that. So my educational mission regarding the Bible is to make it, and especially eschatology, so very clear for you guys by presenting things paradigmatically, as a paradigm, and systematically, because everything goes together. So I hope I was able to do that today. So thank you guys all for watching. God bless you, and I will see you on the next video.